welcome to Forbidden Planet TV and welcome to an extra special segment we've got today. It's all about one of our favourite subjects, gaming, and one of our kind of newest releases that have just come into the store, which we're super hyped about. But first, a quick kind of intro. So I'm Laura, I'm the head book buyer for Forbidden Planet and also a huge JRPG nerd. So yeah, any kind of Final Fantasy, Fire Emblem, Xenogears, all the good stuff. You can chat to me about it. We've got Ross with me today, who's our marketing manager and also a huge gamer. Say hey, Ross.
Hello, welcome. And yes, huge gamer, JRPGs, and pretty much everything. But howdy.
Good. And you're even brave enough to attempt some Soulsborne, so you know.
I am. We'll get on to that a bit later, but yeah, definitely.
And we're here joined by our extra special guest, Aidan Moher. Say hey, Aidan.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. This is great.
Oh my god, super hyped. And we're here obviously to talk about Fight Magic Items, your new first book, and hopefully one of many kind of books about JRPGs and gaming. I hope.
One can hope. I've got a few follow-up ideas that I'm working on, and hopefully you guys will get to read those as well eventually.
Oh my god. Oh, amazing. So let's start off with, how did this like wonderful book come into being?
Yeah, so I mean, the beginning of the book, the start of the book has to go all the way back to like childhood, which is, you know, I cover it in Fight Magic Items and how, as I grew up, I grew up in a household with a lot of books, thousands of books. Both of my parents were readers. My dad's a writer. He's also a technophile, so he was always sort of on the cutting edge of technology. We always had computers. I was on the internet, you know, way long ago when I was a little kid, and it wasn't hard to convince him to, you know, buy video games and get new video game consoles, because he was always sort of interested in them. He didn't play them a lot, but he was interested in having them and seeing us play with them. And so that, coupled with my mom's love of science fiction and fantasy, I was a huge reader. I loved science fiction and fantasy books. I was big into science fiction, and then I discovered Tolkien and then Terry Brooks, and from there it kind of moved into epic fantasy, and then that became my real true love when I was around 11 or 12, was epic fantasy. And around the same time is when a lot of the golden age Japanese RPGs started to really kind of hit. And so that was stuff like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, all those Super NES ones. And then, of course, the big boom on the PlayStation as I moved through like in high school, as I was a teenager. So I was like, you know, the perfect age for that golden age of Japanese RPGs, and also the big boom in like 90s epic fantasy, right? Where it was sort of revitalized in the 80s by Terry Brooks and Stephen Donaldson and some others. Then Raymond Feist and Tad Williams and Robin Hobb kind of came along in the 90s and really kind of like pushed it into new directions as it moved away from sort of that really sort of faux Tolkien-esque Saturday morning cartoony style of epic fantasy into something that was a little more, you know, I don't like the word mature, but it did sort of follow, the books followed a similar path as Japanese RPGs, right? They sort of started as these very like tropey adventures, and then eventually they sort of started to explore more territory narratively and thematically, and epic fantasy books are doing the same thing. And so I just loved these things, right? I loved video games, I loved books, and they kind of came together into a confluence that just, you know, defined my creative interests. And now as an adult and a professional writer, like the things I like to write and write about, and so I write fiction, and it's heavily inspired by Japanese RPGs, you know, like inspired as much by Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, as Tolkien, for instance. But then also I write, you know, stuff like Fight Magic Items, which is nonfiction and covers all of that. So as you know, as I grew up, I ran a book blog for a number of years called A Dribble of Ink, which was fairly successful, and that was a lot of fun, but I kind of closed it down after a while and made a leap into freelance writing. But there's not a ton of money in writing about books. There's not a lot of money in writing about games either, but a little bit more. So I was decided, like, let's try out some games writing. And so I pitched a piece, and we were talking about this just before we started recording, but it was a piece specifically about how Japanese RPGs the golden age ones in the 90s inspired a whole generation of writers, science fiction and fantasy writers. And so I wrote that piece for Kotaku. It was sort of my debut as a games writer. Spoke with like Tamsin Muir and Scott Lynch and a whole bunch of amazing writers who were influenced by these games, showing that they're like, you know, they're not two separate fandoms. Like there's so much overlap. And then that hit really hard with readers, and I got a ton of positive feedback saying, like, you know, people coming to me and being like, hey, I didn't, you know, I love these things also, but I didn't know I could let Japanese RPGs influence my books. I didn't know I could look to Final Fantasy to help me shape the novel that I'm working on. And so from there, it was like, okay, well, there's like very clearly a lot of crossover here, and a very clearly a big audience of people who love books and love video games. And so I kept kind of pursuing that as a games writer. And so I would cover Japanese RPGs. I wrote about Chrono Trigger and Lunar Silver Star Story Complete and other stuff. And in all of these pieces, I would try to bring personal experience to the forefront. Not just write about the games, but write about the people who made them, write about the people who played them, and, you know, myself sort of as a proxy, and the feelings that we have playing these and how they shape us and why they shape us. Brought that into a lot of my writing, and a fellow writer and agent named Eric Smith, who is now my agent, really liked those. And so at a point we got talking about potentially writing a book version of, you know, what I was writing for freelance games writing pieces. And that became Fight Magic Items, which is just the story of Japanese RPGs, the history of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, but the people who make them, the people who play them, and then their journey and their to the West and their rise through the 90s, and looking at how these sort of kind of strange Japanese games that were specifically made, modeled by like off Western games like Ultima and Wizardry, by Japanese creators specifically for a Japanese audience. Like the whole idea was like, let's take this Western idea of an RPG on computers and make it accessible in Japanese living rooms. So it's like, it's very Japanese idea, but there's also this cultural exchange. And then how did that genre created for Japanese players blow up in the West and then continue like to this day to shape how games are made. And so it tells that story of their, you know, their beginnings and their move to the West, and then that explosion, and now how we have the next generation of creators who were growing up playing Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and Phantasy Star 4. They're the ones making games now, and they're drawing on those inspirations. So it kind of covers that full gamut of like that first generation of creator to like the modern generation of creator who was motivated and inspired by Sakaguchi and Yuji Horii, who created Dragon Quest.
And you make your kind of book such a personal account as well, which kind of just makes it even more interesting, because I think that's the one thing about kind of gamers is whenever you meet someone who's a gamer who's into maybe like the same games you are, then it's just like you understand, like when I cried at this scene, you probably did as well.
It's been really gratifying to hear from readers about how impactful the personal side of the story that I tell has been, because that was, you know, there was a lot of conversation as I was writing the book and conceptualizing it and outlining it, and, you know, how much of the author should be in a history, right? We're in a very, very unique place though, where, you know, a lot of the time authors covering history weren't around. If you're writing about the fall of Rome, you weren't there, right? The people who, you know, caused that to happen or were directly impacted by it are not around. Video games and Japanese RPGs in particular are really interesting because like the people who created Japanese RPGs, like they're not only still alive, they're still making games, right? Like this is the beginning of a living history. The people who grew up and were influenced by these games, who played them on release, they're still playing games, right? They're in their 40s, they're like early 50s, you know, making games, making other things like books. And so to me, you know, I think of the book, it's a history of Japanese RPGs. I also think of it as a bit of a memoir, but not a memoir of me, but a memoir of players. And, you know, my story is the proxy for those players, because I think that, like you say, even if they don't have the exact same memories of Lunar or Chrono Trigger that I have, they have those memories about Phantasy Star or Final Fantasy IV or Persona 3, right? And it's those feelings and those emotions and those connections that we make to these games that sort of forms the emotional core of this book. And so that's where I felt like bringing my own experiences and story into the text would be really useful for outlining and explaining and showing that connection to games, because these, you know, games shape and move us just the way that movies or music or books or art visual art does. And I worked really hard to find that balance, and it's been so gratifying that it's connected with people in the way that it has.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just incredible, because you kind of, so I was reading obviously in your book about you kind of growing up and obviously playing games with friends, going around to people's houses and kind of, like playing the same game at the same time, but on like two different consoles or two different screens. And I think obviously that, is such a part of your childhood and growing up. I suppose, the very opposite thing. I didn't have any friends who were into gaming. Like, it was just me. So you like rush home from like school because you had just something that you had to do, and it was like Suikoden. You had to get home, kind of thing. But it's great, kind of, I suppose, finding these people kind of later in life, and you're just like, you totally understand. So
I grew up in, I looking back, I realized how lucky I was. But not only did I have like a really tight knit group of friends who we all loved the same games, we all loved Japanese RPGs. But I also, like, in high school, like, it was fine, it was cool. Like, there was no stigma around video games or Japanese RPGs. Like, the older kids, a few grades older than us, like, that's what we connected over. We would share Japanese RPGs. Like, I own a copy of RoboTrek that I swapped for Legend of Dragoon way back in the day. I don't remember who, but it was somebody in an older grade, and we just kind of swapped, and then they probably graduated. But like, it's not often that, couple of grade 10s will form a friendship with a bunch of grade 12s over like, nerdy video games. But for some reason, that was just the culture at my school, and that was really fortunate. It was something that we were all able to kind of bond over and connect over. And it's funny because, like, I think I talk about it in the book. But for me, Japanese RPGs are seen as like a very singular, solitary type of game, right? Like, you play them by yourself. And like, I've spent countless hours and days and nights holed up in my bedroom playing Japanese RPGs by myself. But the way that we would then arrive at school the next morning to talk about them, or like you were saying, like, I had a Commodore 1702 monitor, which came with a Commodore 64. And that's what I grew up gaming on, like with my PlayStation stuff. It was pretty small, pretty light. I'd haul it to my friend's house. I'd put it, the TVs back to back, and we would play through games together, but our own copies on our own console, so we wouldn't spoil it. And like, we would just hang out playing these single player games together. And so for me, they've always also been like a thing that has brought people together in the same way that other people have been, connected over fighting games or racing games or, sports or being in a band together or whatever. Playing Magic cards. We also played a lot of Magic cards back then. But like, these things that like you could do together, even if you weren't actively playing the same game side by side, like in a multiplayer situation.
Yeah, definitely. Because I grew up with an older brother, and we used to kind of play these games like as a team. So it's like a single player, but we would just we would kind of swap controllers, and then, because we grew up with a Super Nintendo, so it was the Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 6, and just really good. But because they're so narrative based, it means that you could play them together, even though only one person's playing. So just amazing to do that.
And I was the older brother. Like, I'm the oldest of three, and my younger brother, who's about 5 years younger than me, during the PlayStation era, that's when he sort of got into Japanese RPGs. And how he got into Japanese RPGs, he would just hang out in my room while I played them. And so he has all these memories of like stuff like Grandia, and like, we have very specific memories together of that. Well, I just kind of played through and he watched. He was too young at that point to really like play it on his own. But it connected us over that way of just being able to hang out and like experience these stories together, right? It's like watching a movie side by side with somebody.
Yeah, definitely.
You're going through those same emotional beats. And that was a pretty cool experience for us, that we still talk about, and we still have in jokes, going all the way back to like Grandia and stuff, like when he was 8 or whatever, and I was 13, and it's good stuff.
And it's I think it's just maybe part of the reason, obviously, that JRPGs have continued to kind of grow and develop, and obviously loads of remakes and stuff happening at the moment. Just the idea of kind of East meets West, and having kind of that perfect combination of stuff we've grown up with and understand, and then this kind of myth and legend from another land, and kind of combining the two. So obviously Final Fantasy VII was probably one of the first to really kind of blow up.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that particular game that, you know, makes it endure and makes it kind of so pivotal?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was big and bold, right? It's kind of set a new standard for narrative and cinematic narrative in Japanese RPGs, which I think is just something that's appealing to Westerners, just in terms of how we consume movies and television and all that kind of stuff. There was a big marketing push behind it. But like that's the easy answer, right? I think what was actually going on is it was concurrent with the rise of just a lot of Japanese media making its way over. Like, you know, we started watching anime around that time, probably a couple of years earlier than that, right? So like we had Sailor Moon and then Dragon Ball, and all of that stuff was coming to the West at the same time, right? And so there was something just really alluring about the way that Final Fantasy looked, the story it wanted to tell. The pixel art graphics of the originals are gorgeous. Like I love the older games, but they didn't necessarily have the level of fidelity to look Japanese. You know, like they didn't, you know, there wasn't much separating it from, you know, the most recent Ultima game, say, right? Like it was still pixel art graphics, and it was still sort of this similar medium, sorry. Whereas Final Fantasy VII had that sort of like graphical push to like really start visualizing and realizing like the anime aesthetic that it really started, the series really started to take on at that point. And so it just looked very different, right? It was very like nobody had really seen a game or you know, a setting like that in a Japanese RPG. And so I think that was a big part of it. I think the sort of consumer capitalist, like anti-capitalist, like anti-consumerism, or the environmentalist aspect of it was also really appealing to people at that time. And like I recently replayed it while I was writing the book, and like I really enjoyed it. It's like it's a pretty flawed game, but it has some really interesting ideas behind it. And like back when I was a kid, when it came out in 1997, you know, I was 13. Was I 13? 1997. Yeah. I was 13, and I just felt smart playing it, right? Like I felt like this was grown up. This is like something that like, you know, felt important. And I think it is. Like again, like going back and playing it 20 years later, I'm like, wow, like there's some pretty profound stuff in here that, like, you know, we're seeing a lot of Final Fantasy VII memes going around on the internet and on social media right now, because like it deals with environmentalism, it deals with like corrupt capitalism, and that's like front of mind culturally. And like I think that part of the reason that, you know, our generation is fairly aware of sort of like the perils of capitalism and like why climate change is so important, is because we can look back at stuff like Final Fantasy VII as like these sort of formative texts in our youth. You know, as how many 13-year-olds were addressing like anti-capitalist like texts, right? And like, you know, Final Fantasy VII is fairly simple, but it brought ideas. You know, like there's that meme that goes around all the time about like how the planet's dying, Cloud, right? And it's Barrett, and he's talking about the planet dying because Shinra is sucking it dry. And meanwhile, Square Enix is like firing up NFT games, right? And so like, you know, like you kind of trace that awareness that we have now, you know, as millennials, older millennials in my case. I think going back and looking at the kind of stuff we were consuming, and just that maturation of the genre, going from telling sort of like just like fairly traditional epic fantasy stories, and then Final Fantasy VI told something that was like starting to step in that direction, right? You know, it was a lot darker. It had that steampunk setting, the end of the world, you know, found family, all that kind of stuff. And then Final Fantasy VII hit, and thematically it was like it was really rich and really bold and really like, oh wow, I've never really kind of thought about games in this way before. And it kept going that, you know, then it follows up with Xenogears like a year later, and it's like, you know, how many 14-year-olds are like, you know, contemplating Jung and you know, Sigmund Freud and Nietzsche, right? Like, and like, you know, like Jewish Gnosticism. Like I didn't know any of that at the time, but I was absolutely, you know, ingesting that and thinking about it in a way that, like, you know, I think has formed a lot of sort of cultural underlie in a lot of people now, 20 years later, 25 years later. And so I think it just hit at the right time. I think it was like, you know, somebody at Square Enix saw opportunity. And so they kicked up a big marketing budget, but I think it was timing with a lot of Japanese media becoming popular at that time. and just you know, telling the right story at the right time as well. I wish we'd taken the right warnings from it, but I feel like we didn't. But yeah, it's complex. Matt Alt is a writer. He has a book called Pure Invention, which is fabulous. And I read it while writing Fight Magic Items, and it became very formative on that experience. And he looks at that cultural exchange, and he starts his book with Final Fantasy VII and uses it as sort of like the case point right at the beginning of the book about like how and why pop culture sort of had this explosion in popularity at the beginning of or in the mid 90s. And I think that it does a good job of looking, and then it kind of rewinds back to like post-war Japan, and like the connection there between like US military and Japan after the war, and you know, the toys that were being made and, you know, shaped after sort of US military vehicles and Jeeps and stuff like that, and how there was that kind of connection, that cultural connection over toys and games, like right back at the very beginning, like after the war. And that's just kind of continued. I think there's this natural connection between Japanese pop culture and American pop culture. And Final Fantasy VII just kind of was that maelstrom of like everything that both consumers in both countries wanted at the time.
Yeah, and I think that Final Fantasy VII also came across as quite mature.
Yeah.
I felt that it always had kind of classical music, like real classical music in it, and it referred to kind of ancient Greece and Rome and historical events. And yeah, it felt mature. And as a kid growing up, it was like, yeah, really refreshing kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I felt that Final Fantasy VII really nailed that. So yeah, you're right, definitely.
Yeah, and it did feel more like it was set in, like it wasn't, well, I guess technically it is set in our world, because you cast the meteor spell at the end of the game, or whatever it's called. I think it's meteor, and like it crashes through Jupiter and Saturn, and then crashes into like what's clearly Earth. And now, is that canonical? Like, is Final Fantasy VII set on Earth? Like, I don't know, but it's clearly modeled on Earth, right?
Yeah.
In a way that the earlier games weren't. In the original version of Final Fantasy VII was going to be set in New York City. And there was a script, and I don't know if there's a full script, but there was a concept of being set in New York City, and it was about a detective named Hot Blooded Joe. And that was eventually scrapped for what we got. And then parts of it were used for Parasite Eve, which is where that New York setting comes from, I think. But there's that connection right at the very beginning, right? To like, you know, like our world and our cultures and our civilization, the specific struggles and challenges that we face sort of at the end of the 20th century. I think that groundedness gave it that level of like maturity that you're talking about, like where it felt like this is a story about us, not just a story about, you know, like fantasy warriors going on an adventure, like a lot of Japanese RPGs had been up to that point.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think so. I'm just playing through the remake at the moment, and it hits just as hard, which I almost didn't expect.
Yeah,
but you know, it's as powerful in parts, and obviously the character development in it is incredible.
Yeah,
like even, you know, like Marlene and stuff. It's like absolutely adorable.
Yeah. It's wild because they didn't have to change too much. Like what's there in the original Final Fantasy VII is just very relevant right now, right? Like with everything that's going on. And a lot of the social movements right now go back to like very specific themes discussed in Final Fantasy VII. And so like they didn't have to rethink. I mean, the remake's kind of weird because they are totally rethinking and like the whole concept of what Final Fantasy VII is, but like they didn't have to readdress those themes. It can still be about like anti-capitalism, about environmentalism, about our responsibility to be stewards of the planet, and that was all there. They didn't have to like, you know, like rethink about what the game's really about. And so they were able to focus on like character development and fleshing these characters out. And what I think it does is a really good job of is like the original is kind of like a caricature of Midgar. Like you see all of its weirdest parts. Not everybody you meet is bad, but like a lot of people are bad. But like in the remake, they really make Midgar feel like this like living city full of people you want to protect. And to me, that's like the ultimate like need for any epic fantasy where like the world's in peril, whether it's a book, right, and the Dark Lord's rising, or it's a video game and Sephiroth is trying to summon you know, the meteor to destroy the planet or whatever. Like it has to be a place full of people that you care about, because you have to want to save it, right? If you don't care about the world, you don't care about saving it. And the new Final Fantasy VII remake does a really good job of like taking Midgar and expanding it into like a world that's like a city that's obviously broken. It's not a great place to live, especially for people under the plate, but you care about the people. You see that they have lives and they have friendships and they have families and they have, you know, like goals and dreams. And so when the plate falls in that game, you see all of that crushed, right? And that's like, you know, it reaches to that on a deeper level because it spends 40 hours in Midgar instead of 7 or whatever. And I think that worked really well in the remake. I'm a big fan of the remake.
That really hit hard when the plate fell in the remake, because as you said, you spent so much time in there, and then it explored the aftermath so much more. Yes. The original, I feel like it was obviously a horrible event, but then we just kind of, that was the reason to keep going, and then you just kind of carried on. So yeah, that really hit a lot harder.
And like you know, you're running through the city on fire, and you're seeing people that you've like done quests for and built a relationship with over time, like struggling through this, right, and trying to help each other. And it's like, that's really important because you care, you care about that world. They feel like friends that you're saving, not just like you know, maps inside of a video game. And Final Fantasy VII did a great job of this at the time, but you know, video games have matured so much as a storytelling device that I feel like we have and can expect just higher standards for that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think as well, like having kind of the humor as well to kind of alleviate some of the kind of heavy going. So I've just done the bit where we're climbing the Shinra building and obviously choose to take the stairs.
Every time. every time. It's so good.
It's got to be done. And even things like Hell House, just fighting Hell House in the Coliseum.
Yeah, I hated that fight, but I was so happy to see that it was in the game, because it's just like Final Fantasy VII is so weird because it throws out so many of the like traditional enemy designs from the first 6 games, but it has some really kooky, weird ones. And I think it's mostly because they didn't really know how to work with polygons very well at that time. So like they had to kind of come up with like whatever, you know, it's like, oh, design a monster that like you can animate, and then we'll figure out what it's called and stuff. Whereas like you look at Final Fantasy 8 and 9, and then they come back and they bring in a lot more of the traditional monsters again in 3D. But 7, like Hell House is just so weird, and it's weird in the game, right? It's like this animated house that fires missiles at you, and it's just in some route, like it just has no context at all. But I like how they, you know, like they kind of run with that gag in the remake and kind of give you a reason for why this thing exists. And then you have to watch the color of the windows to know which attacks to use, and it's a horrible fight to actually finish. But I did appreciate it was in there.
Yeah, no, it was good. I really enjoyed as well. So my my boyfriend's played a few of the Final Fantasies, but he's like a JRPG widow. Whenever I get a new game, it's just like, oh, see but he did the quest where you have to fight the Tombury, and he'd never seen a Tombury before. And he was just like, oh, this is going to be easy. And I was like, don't underestimate that little green dude. Whatever you do, he got slaughtered. So.
And I like the fact that Final Fantasy games always reuse certain enemies. So facing in Final Fantasy X, facing a Tombury for the first time, I knew that was going to be hell. Just straight away, I just saw that and I was like, yeah, this is it.
But you also had that advantage, right?
Yeah,
because like you knew, and you knew what was coming, and so you could, you know, prepare, and you kind of sort of have that like that knowledge that you accrued over time as a fan. And Final Fantasy does that so well because it's so experimental, right? Like it's the whole idea is that every Final Fantasy is different. The settings are different, the stories are different, the gameplay systems are different, but they keep these sort of like signposts, right? And that's the enemies, and that's the spells, and that's sort of some of the themes or the crystals that connect them all into this larger like mosaic, which I think is really, really interesting. Like something like Dragon Quest is more conservative in the way that it, you know, appeals to its fans and tries to feel like a Dragon Quest game, because it, you know, like reuses character models and character designs and like settings and themes and all that kind of stuff. Like every Dragon Quest sort of looks the same, and they all feel like Dragon Quests. But every Final Fantasy, even though it's very different, still feels like a Final Fantasy, because of those things that they pull over and you know, and rewards longtime fans, I think. And then you also just keep the strongest stuff, so you know, over time it just gets distilled into like a stronger and stronger experience for new players as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think as well, so especially at the moment, it's obviously kind of great to see so many older games coming back with like a bit of, you know, lick of paint on. like the era of Kickstarters that we're that we're currently living in. So is there anything from like your kind of back catalogue of favorite games that you would like to either see a new game in that franchise or a remake of?
Yeah, the big thing, we just talked about how much I like Final Fantasy VII Remake, but like a lot of the time I don't feel like remakes are necessary. Like there was Live Alive or Live Alive that just came out, and that remake is fantastic. But the real key to me is accessibility. Like I just love that people are able to play Live Alive now, and it comes with some quality of life improvements, and that's great. So I'd like to see some of the games that are really hard to get a hold of now that get remade or re-released, like the Lunar games, Lunar Silver Star Story Complete and Eternal Blue Complete. They're fantastic and some of my favorite games of all time. I cover them in the book. But they're like impossible to play at this point unless you own physical copies. And that's partly due to a rights dispute. The rights are like scattered across a few different entities, Working Designs, Game Arts, and the Team Alex who made them like got dissolved, and I think nobody really knows where their parts of the rights exist. So like the game probably can't come out in its original form. So what you see is you have the mobile version of the game, and it looks like it's based on the PlayStation and Saturn version graphically, the gameplay and stuff. But then it uses the localization script from the PSP remake, which looked and played totally different. So it's like this weird mishmash of the two. And like that's probably the best version, but it still doesn't really hit. Like it's not what I want people to be able to play. And you look at some of the older like Tales games, Tales of Destiny 2. Like I would love for people to be able to play some of those. We have the Tales of Symphonia remake or remaster that's coming out, which is great. Like we had Vesperia came out, which is great. And I like those style of like remakes that are remasters that are like just trying to get the experience polished up enough, but like mostly focus on accessibility of these old games. Like I don't need, like there was the Trials of Mana remake that came out a couple of years ago. And of course, the original Trials of Mana, which is Secret of Mana 2, didn't come west on the Super Nintendo. It was released too late. And Nintendo 64 was there, so they just never released it. And then all of a sudden, we got not only like a 3D remake, but we also got the original translated. And that was really interesting because I think what happened is they made a really faithful remake in 3D for Trials of Mana. It was really good. It was fun. But they translated it, and they saw that opportunity to put that translation into the Super Nintendo game. And so like if you play the two games, the dialogue and the translation is the same. And so like that was an opportunity where like they could have just left the Super Nintendo original in Japan where it's always been, right? There's, they would probably argue there's not a huge market for a new Super Nintendo game in terms of like, financial payoff. But the opportunity was there to bring it forward, and now a ton of people can play the original Trials of Mana if they want to. And so I really like remakes and remasters like that provide accessibility for people. My number one though, I think like if I could get anything, it would be Trails in the Sky. The first three games on the Switch. They're on Windows, they're on Steam, they're on some other, I have it on PSP, but like it just seems perfect for Switch. And I really want to play those games. I've played a huge chunk of the first one on PSP back when it came out like 10 years ago. But then they re-released it on PC, and it's a really great version. It has tons of quality of life improvements, like it's way faster. But I just can't really play it on my PC. That's not where I game. Like it just seems perfect on the Switch. And I think that's a series that's really having like a bit of an ascension moment right now. Like I feel like, and I've said this before in interviews, like I feel like if I wrote Fight Magic Items in 5 years, 10 years, I'd probably write a lot more about the Trails series, because I think it's at a place right now where it's just starting to like, it reminds me a bit of Persona, where Persona sort of had like this niche following through like the PlayStation era. And then Persona 3 was pretty popular. Persona 4 was like, almost mainstream. And then Persona 5 hit, and it's like, it's huge, right? And I kind of feel like the Trails series is going towards that they're going to have their mainstream moment at some point. And so I do cover Trails in the book a bit, but I feel like, like within 5 years, it's going to be one of those games now that I would have had to cover in the same way that I cover Fire Emblem or Persona, where like, they went from niche and having a really like passionate but fairly small audience to like, just being one of the like foundational modern Japanese RPG series. And so, we just got Tales from Azure. Is that the one that just came out on Switch?
Yes, yeah.
Or is that the one that's coming out?
Oh,
Trails from
that's
Zero.
The one that's coming. Yeah.
Yeah. So Trails from Zero just came out on Switch and other platforms, and then Trails from Azure is coming. And I feel like if they could take that foundation and then just do Trail in the Sky, like first chapter, second chapter, and the third one. That would be pretty great because I could finally play them in the best way possible. People tell me to get a Steam Deck to play it, which I'd love to do, but Steam Decks they're pricey.
Yeah, you're right, because that mainstream moment for certain franchises is definitely something that kind of propels them and always gets like way more coverage. I always think that the bridge between like JRPGs and stuff like that and the modern audience and like everybody else is Super Smash. Because as soon as they feature on that and everyone's like, oh wow, okay, let's I remember when Ness and Lucas were on Super Smash from Earthbound, and everyone was like, no idea where these people are from. And then suddenly it kind of research into that, and they're like, oh, these are amazing games. And like Persona's in it, Fire Emblem, and all these amazing games.
Xenoblade had the same thing. Shulk was in Smash, and then it became huge. I like it. That's a good theory.
I think as well, there's just kind of so many, like you touched on there, so many games. I think people missed out on whether they had the right console to play it. So way back when. So with Persona 3 and 4, which I'm super looking, because I've never played them, I'm super looking forward to the opportunity to playing those, because I adore Persona 5.
And like Persona 5 is my least favorite of those three. Like I think 3 and 4 are I mean, like again, like they're older, right? So they don't have the same level of sort of modern polish or modern sort of design ideology. But like to me, those are they're fantastic and they're so good. Now I prefer them to 5. I think 5's great, but it's way too long. And the localization is sort of weird. And I really like those older games. But like it's about getting them into people's hands, right? Making sure that they're accessible. Like a book is a book, right? And like if you have a 40-year-old copy of a book, you find it in your mom's closet, you can pick it up and you can read it. If you're digging through your mom's closet and you find a 40-year-old copy of like Dragon Quest, you can't play it unless you have a Nintendo, right? And so like, how do you get that into people's hands? How do you make these games accessible? Like like just to my left here, I have a bunch of old game consoles and tube TVs set up. Like I like playing old games. I don't necessarily need like them to be like modernized. I just need them to be accessible, because it's not realistic to expect people to put in the level of like effort or money that I have into getting old game systems set up. When you could release them on modern consoles in ways that are more accessible. And that's where stuff like emulation comes in, which I think is really important in terms of like preservation of these games and access for people. And that's there's obviously a lot of tricky stuff around emulation. You need to make sure that you legally acquire ROMs and all that kind of stuff, but the way it does provide access to platforms that might otherwise be impossible to get your hands on, or you don't have anywhere to hook them up, I think has been such a boon for video games, and kind of created a level playing field to something like books as well, because you can you should be able to, if you can get your hands on a legal copy of a ROM, you should be able to play it via emulation at this point. And that that method is legal. So it's just about making sure that you have it, just like you need to have the book to read it. And so that's cool. Like I really admire what the kind of emulation scene has been doing in terms of providing accessibility, but also like preservation, because it's like it's so easy to lose. Like digital ephemera is so fragile. It's so easy to lose this stuff if there isn't proper preservation going into it. And that's where, again, like, accessibility is number one for me when it comes to stuff like remakes or re-releases or remasters. It's like getting these experiences. Like they recently re-released Chrono Cross on the Switch and a few other platforms, and it's not a very good remaster. Like I think that like they didn't really treat the graphics in a way that was respectful or like intentional to try to recreate the original experience. They give it to you in like raw, like upscaled pixels, or like this smeary, like filtered backgrounds. And neither of those are appealing to me when I can just load it up on my tube TV and have this gorgeous version of Chrono Cross, but it's there and it's accessible. And Chrono Cross wasn't easy to play, as of last year, but now it is, right? And it's fairly affordable, and you can get across a ton of consoles. And that's the important thing. It's like, is it perfect? Like, no, it's not, but it's there and people can experience it. And I've seen a little resurgence of like love for Chrono Cross now, and like more and more people discovering it, right? Which is great, because it's, you know, it's a divisive game. And so like it's interesting to see people, you know, 20 years later, almost 25 years later, like checking out this game that like had such high expectations, like the weight on it to succeed Chrono Trigger, which is so beloved. It was like bound to fail back then, but now with like 20 years of hindsight, people can look at it as like its own fresh experience, and I think that's really interesting. But that's only possible if it's accessible for people to get and play.
Yeah, because the emulation scene is definitely becoming more and more kind of the way it kind of has to be, because if you think about the scarcity of cartridges and things like that, eventually it's horrible to think, but we'll only be able to do emulation, right? And I guess that unless someone boots up the old cartridge factory and starts making new ones, it's going to be it's difficult to kind of access some of these games, isn't it?
One of the great things that's happening now is called like their FPGA consoles. And so what they do is instead of software emulation, like the way an emulator on my computer works, is it tries to emulate the software. It reads the software code and then tries to play it back by a set of rules that are supposed to like emulate the console. But like the FPGA actually like clones the hardware itself. It emulates the hardware itself. So it's like field programmable gate arrays. So you basically program it to be a Super Nintendo, and it behaves like a Super Nintendo. So you can plug, so I have an analog, a Super NT, so I can plug my old Super Nintendo carts right into there. They play flawlessly. But there's also a device called the Mister, which is an open source project that you can buy pre-assembled, or you can buy all the parts and make it. And it has a bunch of different cores from all sorts of different consoles, and they play perfectly. And they can read like ROM files and stuff, and you can plug them in and it'll upscale like right onto your flat screen TV, right? So like if you plug a Super Nintendo directly into your flat screen, it's going to look really bad because those TVs they don't care about 240p. Like they don't know what it is. They don't care. Nothing is made in 240p anymore. So they scale it in weird ways. It looks awful. But if you have a Mister or an analog Super NT, you plug it into your TV and it upscales properly on its own. And these games look gorgeous all of a sudden. And with the Mister, you can play all sorts of, you could play Sega Genesis, you could play Master System, you could play, like Game Boy and Super Nintendo. Like Sega Saturn is having a lot of like real great development on it. So it's like, this sort of one all-in-one device to give accessibility, to take that barrier away of having people having to keep tons of consoles around. And I'm watching more and more people that like, have been into like older games and older hardware and retro gaming, getting Misters and be like, well, I guess I can just sell all of my old consoles. Like I don't need these. And these are people who have spent like thousands of dollars creating like retro gaming setups that are great and fit their purposes, and they love them and they have all the games, and then they get this Mister device and they're like, well, I guess I just dump all my games, get my ROMs, and then like I don't need any of these consoles anymore, right? You can still keep your collection around. But like, you go from I have like 8 consoles sitting out beside me to having like a little box the size of like, a couple of cassette tapes. If people even know what cassette tapes look like anymore. That's probably a bad example. I'm dating myself, but smaller than a Steam Deck, let's put it that way.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, it's great. I think that we're moving towards a place where like accessibility and freedom to like explore games history is only getting better and better and better. And we're still so early in video game history, but there's so much there, and being able to tell those stories now while the creators are still alive, while the games are still having like direct impact, it's just like such a fabulous experience. And it's it's been challenging while writing the book. Like, where do you start or where do you stop when you're writing a history that's still ongoing? My friend Daniel Dockery, he and I shared an editor. We shared a release date from the same company for a book called Monster Kids. It's about the history of Pokemon. It's fabulous. But he took a very specific time in Pokemon's history from its creation to like a very specific endpoint, so that he could kind of focus in on that and then extrapolate outward from there to show how it sort of had modern impact going forward. Whereas I decided to go off like pretty much the modern day. Like I was doing, I was doing copy edits and like proof passes, and I was like having to add footnotes in to be like, oh, like, just as I was writing this book, they announced like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is actually going to come out. But like, by the time the book came out, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 had already come out. Between like, you know, me finding out about it and then doing proofs and the book coming out. And so it's like, you know, like it's hard and to do that as well. But looking at where modern gaming is going and stuff like, you know, FPGA providing access and these older games inspiring new creators to like make new games that call back to those old games, but also creating projects that allow new players to discover these classic games. Like that community that's built up around retro gaming and games preservation provided a really nice kind of end cap for a lot of the narrative as well. Because like, you know, I think we're all recognizing the need to preserve this history that we have while it's still there and while it's fresh and while it's not being written, you know, by the winners in the future, right? Like how much do we lose when it's not being written? When it's forgotten, once it's forgotten, it's gone, right? But it hasn't been forgotten yet. And so capturing as much of that as we can, whether that's games, whether that's like, you know, stories and anecdote and history itself, I think is really important right now.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think as well, so we mentioned before about obviously the importance of JRPGs kind of looking at the world and kind of giving you a informed decision of things that you may or may not have come across before, but also I suppose the importance of relationships and kind of understanding other people. So is there a particular scene from any game you've played that always sticks with you as being like super kind of poignant or something that, you know, still brings you to tears?
I mean, yeah, lots, right? Like that's why we play them. But I think one that like has never really left me is and a lot of people are going to get to experience this. This is a good example because next year people are going to be able to play this, and it's, you know, it costs hundreds of dollars, like $400 for an original copy of Suikoden 2. But there's a scene where you know, you start the game and you have main character and his friend Joey. So Ryu and Joey, and they're soldiers together, and then they desert together. And so they're like bonded right from the very beginning. They've grown up together, but then they're separated at a point, and Joey's meant to meet them at one of the cities in the game. I can't remember the name of the city, but and so the main character Ryu and his adopted sister Nanami, and then a little girl named Pilika who was saved by Joey at some point, and so she has this very strong relationship with Joey. They're waiting for him, and it's they go out there at daytime when they're meant to wait for him, and he doesn't show up, and the player is given multiple opportunities to be like, okay, I guess he's not coming, let's go in and proceed with the story. But if you wait long enough, he does show up, and eventually he's there, and there's a scene of them just kind of running towards each other as is his reunion that I just think is like very poignant because of then what happens later on in the story. Like it also like you know, like when you think back on it, you're like, oh wow, this is very poignant, this coming together, and then there's a huge separation again that forms like a foundation for like the rest of the story, the game's plot going forward. So I just think it's like really well written in terms of how it shows, you know, people coming together in those found families that we have and the emotional bonds that we have, because that's such a core experience to Japanese RPGs. It's all about assembling people with like causes, but different backgrounds, different cultures, but the same goal, right? It's always about getting your ragtag group of heroes together to fight the big organized, you know, bad guy. And I think that scene was just so emblematic of that. Like these people who like none of them share any blood relation. Like they're all like they've grown up. Some of them have grown up together. Some of them haven't, but they kind of create this family amongst themselves. And that scene, you know, epitomizes that. And it's also very bittersweet because of what follows.
Oh yeah, I think JRPGs have always never shied away from kind of killing off characters as well. And so I think that no other games growing up did the same. And it was kind of the Game of Thrones of video games at the time, wasn't it? And I remember Final Fantasy VII, there was a couple of, I mean, spoilers, although if you haven't played it, what you're doing. Yeah, just a couple of scenes in Final Fantasy VII, I just couldn't believe it as a kid. Like I couldn't believe, I assumed I'd done something wrong. I assumed I had kind of failed or something, but yeah, I liked that it always just went for it with the story as well.
Yeah. You call it, you know, like you say, Suikoden, like we're talking about Suikoden, you say it's like Game of Thrones of video games. It predates Game of Thrones, but it has so much there, right? Like, you know, you want to call it the Game of Thrones of video games, but I think Game of Thrones is the Suikoden of books. right? Like you've got these huge casts, you've got these twisty, like super twisty storylines, you have these like familial relationships that sort of define these epic events. Like Suikoden got there first. And I like, I
hot
don't
take
know.
right there.
I don't know that George Martin was playing a bunch of JRPGs, but I just want to give Suikoden its credit because I think it saw where things were going, right? And Final Fantasy Tactics was the same way. And like, you know, where it had this kind of deep like political storyline wrapped around like fantasy trappings, and epic fantasy definitely went that way, right? Like, and it took a little while. Like Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, like it was around for a decade before it really blew up. And that was a decade after Suikoden came out. But I think that, you know, like again, like, you know, Japanese RPGs, they were pushing boundaries during that generation, big time.
No, definitely. I think because obviously in the first Suikoden you get the kind of father-son relationship as well, which is super interesting, and then obviously the kind of more found family in the second game. But so just so many characters and so many they're such brilliant games. So I'm so pleased that like you were saying, more people get to play them.
That like, to me, that was one of the series that was really like really needed re-release. Like it's just, it does something so unique. And I think the Trails series is sort of the closest we have now in terms of like ongoing epic storylines sort of split across multiple games, large cast of characters and stuff. But like Suikoden just continues to do something that's very unique within that space. And I really hope a lot of people are going to get to play that and experience it now, because it's pretty magical. The way that they do that. And then like, you know, you play Suikoden and then your favorite characters are showing up in Suikoden 2 in like new context, and like, you know, they're off on their next adventure. And I liked what it tells you about how like stories don't end, like they continue. Like Suikoden ended, but then Victor and Fleck were just on to the next adventure, right? And that's pretty cool. I like that about that's something that as a storyteller, someone who writes fiction, like I really take from. Like I'm working on a book right now, and it's one of its protagonists is very much just a guy who's in, you know, the middle of a series of stories, right? Like this is just one of the stories sort of in his life, and there'll be more afterwards. There were many more before, and I think that really ties back to something like Suikoden, where it's showing that, like, you know, a story is just one story among many, and not many games I think are able to really do that in the same way these days.
No, definitely. It was something I enjoyed. I know I mentioned to you about Diofield, but it was something I particularly enjoyed about Diofield was because there was just such a rich kind of political world and loads of kind of secrets and lies and stuff, and you're just trying to kind of figure out whether you're kind of actually good, whether your character is good or neutral or has other
I'm playing Nier Automata right now, which I'm a huge fan of the original. I loved it back in the with the original release, and I've sort of been saving Nier for a rainy day for several years at this point. So I finally decided to play it, and it does very similar things in terms of, like, you know, you're going through these story beats and you're making choices, and you never quite know if you're making the right ones. Like you feel like you don't have the information you need to like judge the sort of ethical or moral implications of the choices you're making. And I think you can trace that way back to this era of Japanese RPG, like Suikoden and like Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, especially Tactics Ogre, which is remarkable because it was a Super Nintendo game originally, but it has like all of that sort of moral complexity, and putting the onus on the player to like try to make strong moral choices within a world that doesn't really allow you to do that and to live with those choices, and knowing that, you know, maybe sometimes you have to make the best of the bad choices, but that doesn't sit well because so many other games are about, you know, being the ultimate good guy, right? Like proving that your values and your kind of moral character is like pristine and that you've wiped out sort of like all the bad guys. But these Japanese RPGs don't let you do that. That is one of the things that I really appreciate about a lot of them. I sort of, in the book, I split them off into sort of Saturday morning cartoon Japanese RPGs and primetime Japanese RPGs. And I look at games like some of the earlier Final Fantasies or Lunar I brought up, or Grandia, and those are very much like you're the good guy and you defeat the bad guys, right? But then on the flip side, the primetime ones are sort of more like morally and ethically complex, harder to kind of sort out. You know, are you the good guy? Are you the bad guy? Or are you just somebody who's like, you know, trying to make your way through? a very difficult situation. Like, you know, somebody like in Suikoden 2, you have Joey, who, like, is he a bad guy? Is he the good guy? Like, it's hard to say. Like, you kind of like, he, you know, chooses a path that he believes is, you know, like righteous and the best path forward for the goals that you both share. You know, and you look at Final Fantasy Tactics from that era, and Ramza and Delita go through the same thing, where they, like, you know, you're playing as Ramza and you're the good guy, but Delita on the other side is, you know, making other choices that, you know, like, as a player you don't necessarily agree with, but at the same time, you know, the world is sort of messy, and I think these capture that very well.
Yes, yeah, no, definitely. I was kind of trying to kind of basically limit down what my favorite kind of pivotal scenes are, and one of them that kind of came back to me, and then I rewatched it, and then I was just like, oh, I'm gonna cry again, was Choo Choo fighting Nikolai and Xenogears. Which is
yeah I just finished Xenogears, actually, and it's full of those moments. None of them involve Choo Choo for me, but it is. There's definitely some fantastic stuff in Xenogears, and it's funny because I also just beat Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and I feel like they contrast, like, they're both created by Takahashi, the same creator. And Xenoblade Chronicles 3, have either of you played it? I won't spoil it, but
no.
It's really interesting. It like very clearly is like influenced by Xenogears. There's a lot of like similar themes, similar story beats, and like structural things. The main character is named Noah, which is a reference to Xenogears' working title, which was Project Noah. But it doesn't have, to me, it never had the same emotional punch because it doesn't have the density of storytelling and character that you found in Xenogears. In Xenogears, like, something happens every 5 or 10 minutes. And so, like, you're constantly kind of sort of being like, you know, invited into the story, and propelled along to the next, you know, whether it's a twist, whether it's sort of an emotional, like, flashback. But in Xenoblade Chronicles, it's like all the story is confined to these really long cutscenes sort of in between chapters. And some of them are really effective. The end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6, incredible stuff. But it's like bookended by 10 to 15 hours of like running around these big fields where there's like, you know, there's not a lot of interaction, there's not a lot of story going on. And so it's just interesting to see the same themes, the same idea of trying to tell this epic story about, like, you know, cyclical generations of people and breaking, you know, cycles of war, but told in very different ways, and how much more effective I think one is than the other. Because I never had any of those moments really in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 that I did with something like Xenogears, because I just didn't really feel like I was spending enough time with, like, consistently, and, like, you know, in a way that was well paced enough with the characters to you know, to really like feel those stakes. Because, like, you know, if there's repercussions for something that happened, but it happened 10 hours ago, and since then I've just sort of been running around fighting big monsters, like, you know, I've had time to relax, right? The tensions dropped, and I felt that happen a lot in Xenoblade Chronicles 3.
No, yeah, no, definitely. I haven't, so at the moment I don't have a Switch, which is, I know I'm missing out on, like,
yeah, it's a good one.
amazing games. But maybe this Christmas is the time.
It's a fantastic system for sure.
Definitely.
So just kind of couple more questions to wrap up, because I'm very aware like an hour is just like
that flew by.
So is there a kind of game or series that you've recently discovered and has now kind of become one of your favorites?
Trails in the Sky is probably one of those. And again, I played the original on PSP 10 years ago, and I liked it, but it was slow. And I think Diablo 3 came out, and then I dropped it for Diablo 3. And then it was always one I wanted to return to, but more recently, what I've sort of come to understand, a lot of it was researching for the book, is understanding like how that series tells stories and how it uses like multiple games and then story arcs within a larger story arc. So you have like the Trails in the Sky series, that tells, you know, like a story over 2 games, and then there's a bridge game after that kind of bridges it into, you know, other games like Trails from Zero and the Trails of Cold Steel games. And I think that as we kind of go back, and look at stuff like Suikoden, I think I want to see more storytelling than that. Like it's just more storytelling like that, because we don't see a lot of it. And so I haven't played the Trails series, so it doesn't quite satisfy what you're asking, but I think it's really cool as well. I'm just going to go look at games that I've recently played through here, and see what pops out at me. I keep track of it all on howlongtobeat.com.
Nice.
Yeah, and that helps me remember what kind of stuff I've played recently. I think one that like really stuck out of me, which probably won't surprise anybody, is Elden Ring as well. I've never really been into the Souls games. I own a bunch of them, and I've played a bit of them here and there. I played about 30 hours of Dark Souls 2, and then just kept getting like ganked by gargoyles and a bell tower, and like was getting so mad because I didn't really understand, and I didn't get the appeal of those games. And I also think structurally they weren't a great fit for me. And I wasn't planning on playing Elden Ring for those reasons. Like I never really like gelled on the series previously, but then I got caught up in the hype and I bought it, and then I played it for like 150 hours and platinumed it on PlayStation, and like did everything I could. Yeah. And so like I became obsessed with it, and I thought it was really interesting because I think that it's traditionally like a very difficult series, right? It's known for being very challenging for people. And I have concerns about like high difficulty and accessibility. Like I think people should be able to enjoy games, and whether they have disabilities that stop them from doing that, or they have like time commitment that only allows them to commit so much time or whatever to one game. I feel like people should be able to experience games to the fullest, and accessibility is really important. There's not a lot of options for people who can't handle the difficulty of those older games. Elden Ring is so interesting because it applies that gameplay style, that difficulty, but then gives you that big open world, right? So if you run up against a wall, you have like 7 other things you can go off and do, and then you go off and do them, and then you come back 20 hours later, and then you steamroll through that area that you were having so much trouble on earlier. And then it gives you, like lots of other options, like the Spirit Ashes, which, like are basically like an AI controlled partner that can help out a lot. And so like, I don't know if it was intentionally trying to make the game easier or more accessible, but like all of these things that they added to that Souls experience created a game that was, not only accessible, but one I became like super obsessed with and ended up like doing everything, right? And then I beat the hardest boss in the game. And like it wasn't easy, but I had that drive to do it because it felt like the game was respecting the time that I had. Whereas like Dark Souls 2 was like I die against a boss and then I die again without retrieving my souls, and I'd feel like I just lost an hour and a half of my time, and that was frustrating for me, because I didn't have the time to waste time, right? Like if I played for an hour and a half and didn't feel like I had made meaningful progression, I felt like it was like a waste of time, right? And that's probably why I've always liked JRPGs, right? Because you sit down and you put that effort in, and at the end of it, you get to that next save spot or through that next story scene, you're like, yeah, okay, I just accomplished something over that hour and a half. And Elden Ring just does a really good job of that. It's just such a fascinating world to explore. Like, even if all you've done is explored the world a bit, you found a little mini dungeon, or you fought one of the, random mini bosses around the world, and you might have leveled up or whatever, you're like, yeah, I accomplished something here, in a way that like other open world games don't necessarily emulate very well. Like they don't like Elden Ring really made it feel like exploring was worth its while, whereas like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which is open world, like you could explore these big regions, but like there was nothing really there that defined that gameplay session from another. Like you would get like crafting components, or you would find a big unique boss and you would beat it, but then like all you're really getting is experience. So like whereas with Elden Ring, like maybe you get a new weapon and you're like, oh, that's cool, like I've been dual wielding katanas, but maybe I want to try out a flail, right? And then you that kind of creates new opportunity for you. And so like Elden Ring, I feel like it's made me really curious now to go back and take the lessons I learned from Elden Ring and apply them to some of the older Souls games, to see if like I can enjoy them now. But at the same time, like if I feel underpowered by a boss, my only recourse is like run around the same like dungeon over and over again in a loop, like grinding enemies, like that just doesn't sit well with me. So I do hope Elden Ring sort of like forms the basis for the future of the series, in a way that's like appealing to me. But yeah, that would be the big new series that I've recently got into, I would say.
I know you mean about the difficulty of Dark Souls, and they're all Soulsborne games. Basically, I've never experienced such highs and lows in a video game. Then, but it's so satisfying when you kill a boss, and you've finally done it. But I mean, JRPGs in general, they always have those optional, like, impossible bosses. Like the Final Fantasy series always have weapons and things like that. The I can't think of which one in Final Fantasy 7 is it, Scarlet or Weapon or Crimson Weapon or something. That is just so Emerald,
Ruby and Emerald.
Ruby, that's the one. And it's just so hard. And as a kid, I was just like, well, that's obviously just impossible. And it was always that optional where you can kind of really test yourself if you want. I always like those. Just like you can complete the game and it's like, well, that's not it. You've always got those guys.
yeah, totally. And like super bosses are something I never really got into in games. Like I never really liked the idea of just grinding for grinding's sake. But I think that Dark Souls sort of gives you an interesting way around that by placing it in an open world in a way that like benefits from its open world more than pretty much every game besides like Breath of the Wild. Like I feel like that's the other open world game that really benefited from being an open world.
Yeah, definitely. Or if you go back to Dark Souls, go back to Dark Souls 3, and then that's like the definitive, but nice and polished, really fast paced. So if you can handle Elden Ring, you can handle Dark Souls 3 definitely.
Well, what's funny is I look back and I watch older videos of like Dark Souls, and it's like it looks slow. I watch some of the boss battles and I'm like, man, they're like, they're projecting their moves like way in advance. Like I almost wonder if like I wonder how hard that game is to go back to now. Like it feels like Elden Ring, some of the bosses were ridiculous. How fast they would chain combos, and then they would like, they'd fake you out like by like winding up for something and then jabbing and stuff. And like none of that happens in the older in Dark Souls. Like you watch it and it's like they project their moves so far in advance and stuff. And it's like, I don't know, like it'd be interesting from that perspective to go back and see just over 10 years whether like, the games, if we've just adapted and adopted enough technique from modern games to kind of find Dark Souls a little easier.
Wow, like Neo. I finally understand us.
yeah, exactly. Oh, another game that I played, it's not a series, it's kind of JRPG adjacent, I guess, but it's Tunic, which came out earlier this year. It's very like Zelda-like, but not like Breath of the Wild, not like newer Zelda, but like very like Legend of Zelda 1. Where you're kind of plunked into this world. It's like aesthetically, like the visuals are obviously very inspired by Zelda, the first Zelda. But it has this like, it has no dialogue, but it has this very kind of like fascinating setting that like really taxes you to like explore and like look for environmental storytelling clues to like progress through the story. And the bosses are really tough, but it has great accessibility options. So if you hit a wall, you can turn on like no fail mode or an easier combat option. To make sure that anybody can get through the game. And it does stuff with story and storytelling that I just find really interesting. Like Japanese RPGs are so dialogue heavy, and they're like, there's so much telling, and it's, really kind of like Baroque in the way that they construct these worlds. And I love it. But Tunic like does all of this without any dialogue. And like you leave that island after it took me 12 hours to beat it. You leave that island knowing exactly what the story was, right? You know exactly what's going on. You got a lot of questions, but those are questions the game wants you to have. And it's incredible to me to watch, like a game that can tell that story without any dialogue. And I think that's something that's really unique to video games, is that like, you place players as active participants in these worlds, and then you can tell stories that you can't necessarily tell in film or television or books. You can't write a book without any words, right? You can't tax the reader to like, I guess, I mean, you can tax the reader to solve puzzles to kind of forge the way, but like your experience in that world becomes part of the story. And I think Tunic that does that really well. And like, I used to walk through here and there when I hit a wall, mostly to like collect a bunch of stuff at the end of the game that I like totally, there were like, there's fairies you could find. Like I was at the end of the game, I hadn't found a single fairy and there's 20 of them. And so like, it's obtuse. Like some people bounce off it, but I think if you go in and be like, okay, this is like, it's okay to ask for help in this game. It's a fabulous experience. And just storytelling in a way that's like just completely different than Japanese RPGs, or completely different than like, like think about how talky Zelda got, right? Like some of the later Zelda's Skyward Sword is like so chatty. There's so much dialogue. Whereas like this kind of shows like the original roots of like, put a player into a world and let them explore and adventure and see what they do. And so Tunic was a good recent one that I think would appeal to a lot of players.
Cool. I discovered the Tales series during lockdown. I'd never played them before, and I started with Tales of Berseria, and I adore. It's still one of my favorites. I've played 4 now of the games, and that's still like my favorite. So yeah, I'm glad I found them.
Yeah, I played a lot of the older Tales games, and I really liked them on the PlayStation and stuff. I started to bounce off them around Vesperia on the 360. Like, I didn't love their transition to 3D. And then I tried to play Tales of Arise when it came out last year, and wasn't a fan for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I like the older games a lot.
Yeah, I played Tales of Symphonia. I think that's the only Tales game I've played, and I do believe that was on the GameCube, I think. Yeah, so that's the only Tales game I played. But yeah, incredible game.
Yes, yeah. Does everyone have hot springs as well? It seems to be like a reoccurring. There must be a hot springs sequence. We must get our characters in bikinis.
It happens
definitely.
in pretty much every JRPG, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Persona does it, and yeah, they all seem to do it at some point. The anime heavy ones, at least.
Yeah,
no, definitely. And for our kind of final question, what are you hoping is going to be underneath the Christmas tree to play on Christmas Day? So what's your like number one must play game for Christmas?
Oh gosh. I mean, for me, I'm looking at some of those like super expensive Super Nintendo games, Earthbound or Ogre Battle. That's where my heart's at, but that's not happening. The big one for me is probably right now God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West. Like I haven't played the original God of War, like the 2018 one. I played the older ones on PlayStation 2. But the new one looks really appealing. I don't have a PlayStation 5 though, so like both those games have come out for PS4, but I don't know if I should get them and play them on PS4 or not. The God of War Ragnarok seems like it's a pretty good experience on PS4, so that's one I've got my eye on right now. And then there's just like a million Japanese RPGs coming out that I just got like I can't even keep up with right now. It's wild. Like Front Mission just came out. Tales of Symphonia Remastered is coming out early next year. Suikoden's coming out next year. And then there's been like, Live, and there's been Diofield Chronicles, there's been Tactics Ogre Reborn, there's been a million Japanese RPGs this year and tactical RPGs. So any of those really that I don't already have, like just to help me keep up. But who has the time for all of that, right?
Yeah.
But I was a big fan of Horizon Zero Dawn when I played it last year, and so I'm really excited for the next one. But I kind of want to save that as my sort of debut on the PlayStation 5 when I eventually can get one. They're hard to find and they're expensive.
Impossible to find.
They've gone up as well, haven't they?
Yeah, I know. They've raised the price 2 years after it came out. Like, man, what world are we living in? There's actually some cool indie Japanese RPGs that I think are also worth looking at right now. One's called Crimson Echoes that I think just came out today. And it's heavily inspired by like the golden age Super Nintendo and PlayStation Japanese RPGs that we kind of all know and love. Final Fantasy VI and Terranigma and Xenogears are ones that like the creators specifically cited as like inspirations. But his whole goal, like he talks about how it's not called Crimson Echoes. What is it called? Crimson Echoes is a fan. It's a fan sequel to Chrono Trigger. That's why it's kind of top of mind to me. Let me see if I can figure out what it is called quickly. But what's interesting about it, it has like gorgeous pixel art graphics, which look really really nice. But he also wants to make a modern Japanese RPG, just kind of based on like the inspiration of the older games that he really liked. And so it comes back to what I was talking to you about people who have grown up playing Final Fantasy VI and Xenogears and all of those Square games during that generation and making new modern games. And so he says like, this isn't a retro game, this is a modern game. It draws on retro aesthetic and retro inspirations, but it's a modern game. It's called Chained Echoes. And it looks really cool. I believe it's Steam, like it's Windows only right now, I think. Oh no, it's coming out on Switch and PlayStation 4 and all sorts of consoles. And it looks really, really cool. It just like, it has this incredible art style that like harkens back again to like, what would happen if the Super Nintendo, like just kept going for 20 years and what people could do on that, right? Like if PlayStation hadn't come in with 3D graphics and like kind of reset the game, like, what would it look like if you had if the 16-bit aesthetic of JRPGs just kind of continued on to this day? So like highly detailed, high res, pixel art graphics, like really nice animations. You have like you battle right on the battlefield, just like Chrono Trigger. Instead of random battles, there's airships and all sorts of stuff. So it's called Chained Echoes, and it is coming out this week, or it just came out. I can't remember exactly what the release date is. It looks really good, and I want to play it.
must play. Ross, what about you? What are you hoping to get for Christmas?
Oh, it's tough because I've only had a Switch for a certain amount of time. I've only had it for about a month, so it's still like quite fresh for me. But I think God of War Ragnarok is probably going to be my one to go to as well. I've somehow managed to avoid all spoilers so far, but yeah, it just looks incredible. Loved the first new one, and yeah, I played the originals back on PS2 and things like that. But yeah, that's going to be incredible. Definitely going to play that. And I think that's probably it. I hopefully manage to not play the new World of Warcraft expansion, even though it keeps on trying to pull me back in. But hopefully I won't. Because yeah, I used to play Warcraft for a good long time, so each new expansion it wants to tempt me back in.
God damn. I've nearly finished. So I had Stellar Glow for the 3DS, which is a very underhyped but amazing.
Yeah, that's a
RPG.
throwback. Yeah,
love that game. So I'm like about a third of the way in or so. So I've still got a bit of a ways to go. But then I think it's going to be Tactics Ogre.
Yeah.
Christmas Day. Well, not Christmas Day. I'm at my parents, and yeah, you got to do family stuff, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
Boxing Day.
Yeah.
Boxing Day.
Gone are the days where Christmas Day, like you get a new game, Super Nintendo or Nintendo DS game or whatever, and just spend the whole afternoon just playing that new game. I miss those days.
Simpler times.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Much
Where
simpler
did it
times.
go? But yeah, let's like I could just chat about this stuff all night, but everyone's got, I'm sure you've got places to be, Aidan. So
yeah, it's the start of the day for me. I know it's the end of the day for you guys, but yeah, start of the day for me. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks. Obviously, this book is incredible. So everyone come to forbiddenplanet.com or any one of our 9 stores, because I've made sure that every store has it front and center. So but yeah, it's an incredible book. So yeah, thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on and supporting the book the way that you have. It's been like such a pleasure to see the book connect with people in the way that it has, and it's nice meeting other people. The pandemic's been so challenging that like getting together, you see so much of your family, but like connecting with other people who have these same interests has been such a joy, and getting to talk with you guys, like I could go for hours more as well. But getting to talk about this stuff is just right in my wheelhouse, and I appreciate you guys giving me the time to do that.
It's been very cool, and thanks so much as well, Ross, for joining in on your first.
No worries.
Yeah, maybe not your last.
Yeah, no, I'd happily do this again. As you said, Aidan, I could talk about games forever. So
right. And so yeah, thank you everyone for watching FPTV. I'm Laura, joined today by Ross and by Aidan, talking about one of the best things in the world, JRPGs. So yeah, come buy the book, come drop by, because we also have some really beautiful art of books. We've got some beautiful Final Fantasy art of books, and yeah, lots of lovely kind of JRPG goodies in the store. So yeah, hopefully see you soon.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.